Hip hinge is the basic movement pattern you need to have down pat if you're going to be doing any kind of deadlifting. A hip hinge is essentially folding at the hips without excessive bend of the knees necessarily. So when you're practicing the hip hinge, if you're just getting used to it, sometimes it's useful to have a wall nearby. So if I was doing this with back to the wall, I wouldn't be touching the wall. Instead, I'd be maybe 6 to 12 inches away from the wall, and it gives you a target for your rear as you go into that hinge position. So if you imagine that a wall is back here, or a dowel or something for me to kind of guide myself, from here I'm going to press my hips back and try to make contact with whatever that is without squatting down. So if it was a small point, I'm not going to go and squat underneath it. Instead, I'm keeping the hips high, and you'll notice that the knees will bend slightly, and that is normal. They're going to have to bend a little bit so that you can get in that position. But once again, you're not squatting down. You're trying to keep the hips as high as you can. So placing your hands on your hips can be helpful as well. Feel like you're pressing your hips to the rear or they're being pulled back. Sometimes it's also helpful to think about rocking your weight back onto your heels, even though ideally you're not going to be rocking your weight back on your heels. You're going to have your feet completely flat on the floor. But if it helps at first to think about this motion here, about rocking your weight back, that can be a good starting point. And as you get more comfortable with a little bit more of a hip bend, of a hip flexion position, then you do less of the lifting of the toes and more of just moving of the hips. So all of those are just some cues to make this make sense. But this is going to be a good exercise to get your hamstrings used to that stretched position, your body used to going into that hip hinge position, and then you would take this into either a single leg variant of a bodyweight hip hinge, or you can move into a deadlift of some sort.